We grieve our changing world because we are witnessing the loss of more than just habitats. We are losing cultures, languages, and a way of life that has sustained First Nations people for centuries. As natural landscapes are altered or destroyed, so too are the traditions, stories, and wisdom tied to them. Indigenous cultures deeply rooted in a land face a unique kind of grief as sacred spaces vanish, and languages, vessels of identity and knowledge, are increasingly endangered. This loss reminds us that the health of the earth and the richness of human diversity is intimately connected. By honoring and learning from the First Nation peoples, we can support efforts to revitalize languages and protect sacred lands. Through individual and collective action, reducing our environmental footprint, advocating for policies that protect the earth, and supporting these rights, we can help heal the wounds of our planet and preserve the cultural and natural heritage we all share.
What I need is for the people who loved my mother to come together outside around a fire and scream and cry and wail and move our bodies and pound the dirt, and just this vision of the way our ancestors did it. The way our ancestors would come together, the tribe or the village around the fire, and move the trauma, move the grief through our bodies together.
Our guest is a shamanic healer who shares her journey about the power of reclaiming lost parts of ourselves while moving through deep despair and the use of communal rituals to release grief and trauma. Through her personal experiences, she reveals how shamanic healing offers hope, purpose, and a deeper connection to the divine. Welcome back. Thank you for listening to the Urban Grief Shamans, and I'm your host, John Moir.
Receiving that soul part back was a foundational piece in helping me move away from living in despair. I had something greater than myself to rely upon.
This is our guest, Betti Rooted Lionheart, a compassionate shamanic healer, spiritual empowerment advocate, and a fire weaver. Her work is all about helping others reconnect with their true selves and healing supported through community and ritual.
Let me start with a bit of a story to illustrate the journey with the grief and despair. I trace it to about 7 years old when I went on a camping trip with my cousin. Her family had a motorhome. We were living in Southern California at the time, and periodically they would take myself and my sister on camping trips with them. And somewhere in California or the desert Southwest, I have a cousin who's my age. And on one of these camping trips, she and I were hanging out in the back top bunk of those old motorhomes. Her dad loved to take pictures. He had one of those old, this was almost 40 years ago, the big cameras with the big lenses. And so we saw him doing that all the time. And so we were pretending to take pictures. We had little jewelry boxes, just yay big. And we had put a sticker on top, and the sticker was the shutter button. So we would hold these up and we would push on the sticker, and that would take a picture. And she had a stack of cards. They were endangered species cards. And so those were the pictures that we were taking, right? So we could take a picture, and we had this actual photograph, this card that is what we just created. And I didn't know before that time what an endangered species was. So that was my introduction to endangered species. And I remember one of those cards, the ocelot, the small wild cat of Central and South America. I am a cat person. I've always been a cat person. We always had cats growing up. And the fact that beautiful wild cat might cease to exist really deeply impacted me. That was when I woke up to what humans were doing to the planet. That was my introduction. And from there, I just kept seeking it out and living with despair. So I was saying that grief If grief is a deep sadness, despair is a deep sadness, but layered onto that is the how can I live with it?
You're talking about
How
control and loss of control, and you feel like you can't do anything
maybe
about it?
maybe because yes, particularly at such a young age, feeling like I couldn't do anything about it. Yes, and so my who I am, the life that I've lived has been a constant search for how can I do something about it? How can I make a difference? How can I help stop species from going extinct? How can I help stop forests from getting leveled?
Hmm.
So that's probably a fairly good description of who I am and how I got to be who I am.
It was really a pivotal moment, wasn't it? To that realization that these things happen to wildlife and the wild spaces in our world, in our backyards that we have no control over. Reading your material, it seemed like it was a huge influence in the direction of your life, and that grief evolved as you learned more about the state of the earth. I got from that. So that journey of that first realization of this big grief and despair, how did that journey unfold for you?
It unfolded such that I felt as an adolescent in high school, I felt very much alone. I didn't have any adult mentors. I didn't talk to my friends about how I was feeling. What I did was just read voraciously and listened to NPR all
Okay.
the time, right? Just taking it in. In one of my recent a shamanic journey, I was shown that from a very young age and still to this day, I've been like an antenna for the pain of the world. And I'm, of course, not the only one. There are other people like me who are very aware, very sensitive to what's happening to the earth, to the cries of the earth, I call it. And there are a lot of people who either choose to not be aware or numb out or just sent it aside. And it's not an easy thing to live with.
The way you describe that is came across an interesting fellow who was a big influence for me was Francis Weller, and he wrote this book. It's about grief. It's called The Wild Edge of Sorrow. And he describes 5 different gates that grief enters us. And one of it is the grief of the world. And I was in a workshop with him. At that time, I was grieving because my father had abandoned me. There were several women in my group. Their grief was heavy, and it was all about the loss of species. I was taken aback by their intensity. No difference between what grief we're carrying. They were just as powerful as coming from an outside source into them, as you describe the grief that you carry
Mhm.
is really, you're picking up the grief of the world or the changes in the world.
Yeah, I think of it as the grief of the collective.
We're both shamanic practitioners, you and I.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you could bring that part into our conversation here. We'll flip back and forth, but I'd
Mhm.
just like to know a little bit more about that, more so for our listeners, because so many of them aren't shamanic people, but exploring the idea of perhaps living a shamanic lifestyle, and certainly using shamanic um, sensibilities to help them through their grief. And so, can share with us, how did you get into it? Give us some of your background and the type of shamanism that you practice daily.
Yeah, I would love to. Oh, let's see. I'll answer the how did I get into it first. And I guess just to keep pulling on the thread of the story, I went from studying agriculture to wanting to learn how to grow food without poison, went to an organic agriculture training program. That's where I met the father of my children and came up with this dream of creating a farm-based intentional community that could survive the collapse of the systems that we rely on. So we landed in New York State on 105 acres to create this dream. And those were the worst, hardest years of my life. And we weren't able to make the farm work. We weren't able to create the community. And at the beginning of 2015, I landed in the deepest, darkest pit in my life. I hit bottom. And we had recognized that we had to give up on the dream of the farm. And it was time to figure out how to make a living, how to support our kids, how to be able to feed our kids in the world that we live in without living in that very different way that I desperately wanted to live and wanted to raise my kids in a very different way. And so what ended up happening is I stumbled across a flyer for a shamanic ancestral workshop in the local food co-op here. And the reason I picked the flyer up wasn't anything to do with shamanism. I didn't know what that was. It said that the Church of Earth Healing. That's what I needed to know about. And when I finally did call the number on the flyer and got a woman on the phone, we decided to meet. It turned out she lived in this area and she was a shamanic healer. And she had a shamanic journey circle. And so I immediately joined the circle. Within a month of that, she was teaching her workshop in which she teaches people to shamanic journey. In the space of 2 days, I learned how to shamanic journey. And that was just it for me. That was the thing that I'd been searching for my whole life, even though I didn't know that I had been looking. I'd been raised Roman Catholic. That really didn't fit well with me.
So what did you do in between that middle part before you went through the door? So you knew that the religious system that you grew up with is not holding you well, but you hadn't quite reached into the shamanic area. Was there a gray area where you just were lost?
The lostness in my life had to do with the despair for the earth, not for lack of a religion to lean on, though from where I sit now, certainly not having something spiritual to hold on to was part of the despair. I didn't know that at the time. I do know that now. I continued to have to go to church for a while, or even if my mom didn't require it, periodically, just to show her that I loved her, right? It wasn't just a complete break. At a certain point, I realized that, I probably would lean more pagan. I knew for several years before learning to shamanic journey, at least a decade, that I wanted to honor the moon in some way. But my energy never got put in that direction. I never sought out much reading on it. I never sought out people to investigate that with. I guess probably because I was in those years of my life of trying to figure out how I was going to make a difference, being in university and then at that farming program and then falling in love and then having kids. There just wasn't ever a time for me to focus on that. But I guess I'll share this story. It's coming up to share that in 2006, my now ex-husband and I were living on a goat dairy in Rio Vista, California. And I decided, it was a full moon. I decided I'm going to go out and do something to honor the moon. So I even tried to dress up in a way that I thought was witchy or something with flowing skirts. And I don't remember what. And I went out into a field on this goat farm and the moon was up in the sky. There was a cat that lived on this farm that I had been friendly with. I love cats. I already said that. But when I went out to do this moon ritual, to just make something up, I had no idea what I was doing. That cat came out and started attacking the skirt that I was wearing and my legs. And I ended up having to retreat into the house to get away from this cat. And I just took that as a omen. I guess I wasn't supposed to do that. And so I didn't. That one little attempt wasn't followed by any other attempts. That was 2006. I found my shamanic teacher, and learned to shamanic journey in 2016. So there was that decade
Uh-huh.
of knowing that I wanted to honor the moon, but not doing anything about it.
How did that path intersect with your teacher? How did that come about? Why that particular person?
Because of the Church of Earth Healing, I had never seen those words put together. And then when I met her, name is Becky Shining Bearheart. When I met her, she shared with me that she had also lived with deep pain for the earth and had lived her life trying to make a difference, a spiritual
Uh-huh.
difference. And she had lived her life off the grid, close to the land, growing her own food, growing her own medicines. And so there was just a lot of resonance there. And she lived 20 minutes away from me.
Oh.
And this was before everything was done on Zoom, right?
Was it a very comfortable feeling being in her space when you first met? Were you shy or did you feel like you came home?
I would say I felt like I came home. Yeah. I am a very shy person, but I felt like I had come home. Yeah.
I guess that's perhaps one of the first shamanic teachings is that you have to dream the existence that you want to be in place. You
Mm.
have to dream that into being. And does that resonate with you? That those are the first steps of this dream that you've created, this reality that you're building for yourself with your property and your just even the fact that you're becoming that you are a shamanic teacher.
Yes. Yeah. We do need to dream into being the life that we want. But we can't just dream. We have to take action. And for me, I would add to that, I have to be
Mhm.
connected to spirit and connected to myself and living as aligned with my values as I can. There are a lot of my values that I'm not in this moment able to live aligned with. Materially, I live pretty middle of the road. American consumer life is what has come of my life, and that's not what I wanted at all. That's not what I was dreaming for many years before we landed here to try to do something differently. So I've had to make peace with that reality, but my life is very spiritually focused. My life revolves around my spiritual connection. And I'm able to live with that right now. I still want to, and I'm still taking the actions to create something different, but that does sustain me for now.
Mhm. As you were moving along your shamanic path, were there any difficulties that you came across that in a way of the teachings that you were given, the practices that you were given, perhaps some of the rituals? Was there any big jolts to your soul, to your system that you weren't expecting?
That were difficult specifically?
Yeah, that it took a big effort to reach up into it, so to speak.
Mm.
I'm thinking of when a door opens for us, we always have that opportunity to go through it. So it means that there has to be a death before there's a new beginning, metaphorically. And I was just wondering if you've yourself had what kind of deaths or many deaths that you might have gone through to become who you are now.
That's an interesting question. Oh, so many deaths, so many dismemberment experiences. But let me see if I can drop into something more specific or see what story wants to come up. I guess what's coming up is that I did not have trouble or struggle with the ritual aspect of it. I actually deeply love the ritual aspect of it. It made immediate sense to me to live in a way of having many little rituals. My earliest ritual was to just daily in the morning light a candle, burn a little sage to honor Grandmother Moan. What became a bit of a struggle a bit further down the line was just how many rituals I was trying to keep up with. It took me a little while to understand that each time a new ritual was given to me, it wasn't necessarily being layered on top of 10 or 100 other rituals. I could begin to let some of the other ones fade out to more completely step into the new ones. I didn't realize that right away. So there was a period of time where I was like, how am I supposed to keep up with all of these many rituals and still keep up with the day to day?
Were they like stepping
Yeah.
stones or steps as you became more spiritually healed, more integrated with spirit?
Yes. Yeah. A lot of the rituals that I work with are part of the integration process for healings that I've experienced. So, for example, in receiving a soul part back, and I should explain that probably just a little bit, that in the shamanic worldview, in moments of trauma, and it can be big trauma or small trauma, we lose pieces of our soul. A part of ourselves that can't cope with what's happening leaves. And so we become less and less whole. I believe probably every human on this planet has had some soul loss, probably significant soul loss. We live in a very traumatizing time. Our spirit guides can find those pieces that have been lost. They can heal them and they can give them back to us. And then the energy of that healed soul part, we need to actively incorporate into ourselves. And so a lot of the rituals are to help do that incorporation work, to help keep that piece of healing in mind. So, for example, often for me, it would be wearing a particular necklace to remind me of a soul part. And then I'm wearing 3 necklaces all the time, or 5 necklaces all the time, or that kind of thing at a certain point. You don't necessarily want to be wearing 10 or 20 necklaces all the time. That's just one little example. Yes. Yeah. And I guess I'd like to share that one of earliest soul retrievals that I received from my teacher was a 7-year-old soul part. It was that 7-year-old self that learned about the endangered species and felt so deeply for that ocelot. And receiving that soul part back, this would have been in 2016, was a foundational piece in helping me move away from living in despair. I no longer live in despair once I found this shamanic spiritual path, once I had something greater than myself to rely upon, to go to understand how to live my life, to begin to understand, why am I on this planet? How am I supposed to make a difference? That's what I had been looking for my whole life. So this spiritual path led me to that, getting that soul part back and starting to have my own spiritual connection and starting to understand why I'm here. And why I'm here is to be a shamanic healer and is to connect people with their own direct connection to the divine. All of that has helped me no longer live in that despair, no longer live in that place of deep grief layered with the how can I live with this? And part of the definition of despair is having a lack of hope. And so moving away from that lack of hope, moving into a space of hopefulness has made such a huge difference in my life. And it has brought me to this place where actually in 2016, I also in 2016 found the work that reconnects, which was developed by Joanna Macy and her colleague starting in 1978, which was the year that I was born, but I was 37 before I discovered it. And once I discovered it, I was like, how could I possibly have not known about this? The work that reconnects in this amazing group process, bringing people together to share our grief and despair for the earth, to be witnessed. It's amazing to be witnessed. It's amazing to witness others. It's very transformational Going from feeling like I'm alone in this my whole life to sitting in a circle of people who all feel this way. So in 2016, I went to as many workshops as I was able to drive to and stepped into, had a very spiritual experience in one of these rituals, in one of these workshops, one of these deep grief rituals that was like a baptism into now offering holding these workshops myself. So in 2016, I began doing that. And I should say, I also received a soul part back to do with my voice, which allowed me to step into leading workshops. Because when I was in high school, I have very specific memory of standing in front of the class. I don't know what I was supposed to be delivering, shaking and practically stuttering, being in front of a group of people, not my comfort zone. Receiving that soul part back to do with my voice totally changed that for me. Very quickly, like within months of that, was standing in front of small groups of people, facilitating this very deep process.
It's a nice segue into the question about your wailing circles. So share your experience and perhaps how the wailing circles have helped others. If you have a few stories that you could share.
And that I want to start that by sharing the story of my mother's death, because the Wailing Circle came for me from my mother's death. So in 2022, on May 13th of 2022, I got the phone call. And my mom had a stroke. She was still alive. She was at the hospital. The prognosis at that point was that she might survive but be half paralyzed. And so as soon as I got off the phone, of course, I'm a shamanic healer. I am going to try to do something to help. I'm going to try to heal my mom. So I went into a shamanic journey, and I went with my spirit guides to her hospital room. I sometimes, if the issue I'm dealing with is physical, I turn into a black bear. And so I did. I turned into a black bear. I stood behind her head, at the head of her bed, at her head, and I put my bear paws on her head. And she immediately said, "Take your hands off my head and stand back." Mm. And I'm getting a little bit teary about it right now because it was just so clear. Take your hands off of my head and stand back. He did not want to fix this. And of course I did. I stood back. She made it clear that I could be there. I can be supporting her. I can be giving her love. But we were not going to fix this. And that was a Friday, and she had another stroke. I think it was into the night on Friday, and Saturday morning is when my dad and my sister decided to take her off of all life support except for just not forced air, but just passive air at her nose. And I am so glad that I did that journey because it gave me so much peace. It let me know that this was what she wanted. Mm-hmm. One of my mom's greatest fears was being half paralyzed or losing her cognition and living for decades without knowing her loved ones. She had those two very specific fears about aging and her own death process. She was a go-go-do. She did not want to have to stick around in the body with only use of half, one arm and one leg. So I know that she was really pleased with how she died. So I live in New York State. My parents live in Florida. I flew to Florida. I was able to spend the last 2 days of her life with her at her bedside, listening to the labored breathing. I knew the moment the breathing changed and she was moving into the last few minutes, the last few breaths. But I do want to say that before that, she was in hospice, and this hospice had a beautiful little courtyard garden. It was really an amazing place for her, but also her family to be held as she was dying. I did several journeys trying to do soul retrieval, just trying to do healing for her to help her be that much further along when she gets to the other side to cross over. And I've been given a death song by my spirit guides, so I would sit at her bedside and sing that song. And at a certain point, and I want to say too that this was my first experience of what my spirit guides call walking with death. I had known before this that walking with death is part of what I'm being called to do, but I'd never done it before. And it's fairly profound to have done it with my own mother. At a certain point in this process of me trying to pull out all of my shamanic skills and make a difference, I realized this isn't about me. This is her process. And it's not for me. It doesn't harm anything for me to be doing these things. But it's not about that. It's about me being present with her and holding space and just walking with her death. And that was a big learning that I'm really grateful to have
I say it's a powerful
received.
teaching to have that realization that it's not
Yes.
about just step out away, step
Yes.
away.
Yes. And because I'm a shamanic healer, because I have a relationship with the spirit world, with my spirit guides, because I've thought for many years very differently about death, this culture, and when I say this culture, I'm a white American, and we have a very unhealthy concept, relationship with death. We want to pretend that it doesn't exist. We don't have, to me, we don't have adequate rituals to deal with death, not for those that remain living, not for those who've died. My mom had a Catholic memorial mass, which is what she needed, but it's not what I needed. My dad and my sister and my brother were all really shocked and really, really despairing, I would say, like really in that place of no hope and how do I live with this? And I wasn't. I'd been expecting something to happen to one of my parents for quite a while, and I'm just so steeped in spirituality and what I would like death and a ritual around death to look like. So I was able to be a solid pillar for my family in their grief and in their despair. When we were in this Catholic memorial mass, which is what my mom needed and not what I needed, I was sitting there just really thinking like, this is so not what I need. What I need is for the people who loved my mother to come together outside around a fire and scream and cry and wail and move our bodies and pound the dirt, and just this vision of the way our ancestors did it, the way our ancestors would come together, the tribe or the village around the fire, and move the trauma, move the grief through our bodies together. That's where the Wailing Circle comes from for me. And so I knew that that vision had been given to me so that I would create it. And I mentioned starting in 2016 with the work that reconnects, facilitating those workshops. Through that process, I met a woman who attended 2 of my workshops who then partnered with me to create what we've been calling the Despair and Discovery Circle. That's been ongoing since the beginning of 2019. And that had a core group of people when I came home from Florida in 2022 after my mom's death. I spoke to my friend who held the Despair and Discovery Circle with me and shared this vision I had for something that was slightly similar, but way more deep and profound. And so she and one other woman from the Despair Circle and I came together around a fire. And that was the first try, right? We had a very small circle, an experience of it. Of course, we weren't able to tap into creating that vision, but it was a start. And then there was a second iteration with a friend of mine who's a shamanic healer who also works with trauma. And he and we were going to hold it together. Vulture came in very strongly as a spirit guide for me, specifically for the Wailing Circle. And so very shortly after Vulture came in as a guide, I found, driving down the road, a freshly killed but unmarred vulture, and I picked it up. That was a gift from the spirits. I brought it home. I saved the wings and the tail and some feathers. And so at that second Wailing Circle, the vulture wings, the vulture tail, I had also saved a little bit of the scalp and neck feathers. They were holding the four directions, the head and the neck in the north, the tail in the south, and the wings in the east and the west. And when we went around the circle of sharing a second time, one of the women wanted to try holding the vulture wing. And she did. She stood up and she danced. And it just unlocked something really amazing for me and for her, and I think for others in the circle. And so that woman, I reached out to her. She's a healer of a different kind. And we together held the third iteration of the Wailing Circle. And the third time was there's a medicine wheel on the land here at Braided Root Waters Healing Sanctuary. And we held it at the fire in the center of the medicine wheel. And when she and I think 2 of the 5 participants were gathered there, just waiting, sitting with some silence, waiting for the rest of the people to arrive, a swarm of hummingbirds, no, a swarm of bees. We started hearing this humming. It was behind me. This swarm of bees came and just girded us, and from the north and then left to the east. And that was such a powerful experience. The co-facilitator was in tears. For me, Honeybee was the first spirit guide that I met myself in a shamanic journey. And the medicine of Honeybee for me is I manifest nourishment for myself and others in community. That was just such a message from spirit that this Wailing Circle is nourishment for myself and my community. And I want to share also the vulture medicine, see if I can recall that. The vulture medicine specific to the Wailing Circle is coming together in a circle to uncover the truth and renew life by picking the flesh from the bones. That's what we're doing in a Wailing Circle. And the Wailing Circle it's very different than the Despair Circle. In the Despair Circle, we pass a talking stick. Each person takes a turn sharing and being witnessed. And there's deep healing and transformation in that. In the Wailing Circle, we're all deeply into our process at the same time. It's that vision that I shared of coming together around the fire and all of us all at the same time, screaming, crying, wailing, moving our bodies, pounding the earth, we're holding each other in this greater container, but we're all experiencing the emotion and allowing it to move through us. So it was a group of 4 women, so it was small, but we all went really deeply into that place of really letting the emotion, letting the trauma out of our bodies through our voices. And at a certain point, after I had moved the trauma that I was going to be moving, that wanted to move through and out of me that time, I was just using my voice, raising it and lowering it, using my voice to help others access their voices, and really had this profound realization that, oh my goddess, this is what my voice is for. This is what my voice is for, doing this, for using my voice to open the voices of others, to unlock the grief and the despair and the trauma and help them let it out of their bodies.
Thank you for joining us in this deeply moving conversation with Betti Rooted Lionheart. Through her powerful stories and experiences, we've touched on the importance of honoring grief, embracing communal healing, and the profound impact of reconnecting with our spiritual selves. As Betti shared, our voices and rituals can be tools to release deep pain and trauma, whether personal or collective. And we invite you to reflect on how grief may live within you, and how sacred spaces, whether around the fire, in ritual, or within community, can help move that energy through and out of your body. Thank you for being part of this important dialogue today. Stay tuned for more episodes where we continue to explore healing, transformation, and the power of shared human experiences. So take care, and until next time, keep finding ways to honor your path and your grief.